Japan's Pride Fighting Championships wasn't just a promotion. It was a force of nature. For years, it burned brighter than any before it. But no fire burns forever. Beneath the bright lights and the roaring crowds, shadows gathered. Behind the spectacle, the cracks began to show. Unseen hands shaped Pride's fate. Whispers of corruption. The business of Pride, as untamed as the fights it celebrated, became its undoing. What once felt invincible began to unravel. The fall of Pride was as dramatic as its rise. A kingdom built on dreams, undone by reality. This is the story of how it all came crashing down. This is the fall of Pride. Welcome to Deeper Into the Cage. My friends, welcome to Deeper Into the Cage. It's been a privilege to look under the hood of the Vice series Dark Side of the Cage. You can see Dark Side of the Cage on Vice, on Canada, it's on Crave. Follow at Vice TV to see where you can watch it all around the world. Today, we are looking deeper into the fall of Pride. Before we get into it, take a look at the trailer.
Pride Fighting Championships was a great time and nobody died. Well, I guess that's not true, but...
Yakuza bodyguards put a gun to my head. They said, sign it.
It wasn't a surprise about Yakuza existing in mixed martial arts.
When somebody's paying you that kind of money, you don't ask certain questions.
Fans and fighters started to realize Pride will not survive.
Dark Side of the Cage, Wednesdays at 10 on Vice.
Josh, I want to talk to you a little bit about Pride, which is now kind of a small chapter of a very big life as an artist and a martial artist for you. But when somebody, a young fighter brings it up and asks you about it, what are some of the root things you tell them about Pride in that era?
I think a better way of describing this is, what is it that they usually say? And this is the commonality. Pride was the best. Pride was the best. Nothing was better than Pride. Everybody that hasn't watched Pride is really missing out. That is the through line. That's what I hear more and more and more. And Pride was a big part of my life, and it still does play a big factor, especially every time I'm in Japan. And Ryzen is doing a very good job of trying to rekindle that, but Pride being the originator and being in and of its time, I think that's another thing that people have a hard time wrapping their head around, is that, Pride comes off how it does in its time because of what's around it, and the moments and the way things in MMA in the world were at that time. Whereas now, Ryzen does pretty much everything just like Pride used to, but it doesn't have the same impact that Pride did. But that doesn't make Ryzen worse necessarily in any way. And in fact, it might not be anything that Ryzen is doing wrong, although we have to at least come into this thinking that they're not perfect. But it could also just be temperaments and just sort of whatever the way the wind is blowing at the time, and in different cultures. And there you go. I know Pride, as big as it was in Japan, it didn't really need to be in the US. While there was US penetration into the market, it wasn't the same, and they didn't need it because, man, they were putting on the biggest shows in the world, still the biggest shows in MMA that have ever happened. And what do they need to come over here to do anything for? They didn't, but they could have, and if they'd done it a lot earlier, it would have been a lot better for them. But it is the way things turned out, how they turned out, and the people who made these decisions. You can't always make the right ones. We could sit back and really try to dissect that, but ultimately the thing is, the right decisions weren't made, and they were just one of many that ended up costing them in the end. But Pride and now Ryzen is an incredible experience, and night and day from being at a UFC card. That's not just to say better or worse. It's just to say they're just very different products with a very different feel. And I would say, KSW over in Poland
Yeah.
would fall into the same. These guys were at Pride and were so taken by what they saw that they went back to Poland and have fought to and forged to recreate it in what is easily Europe's biggest MMA organization. But it doesn't get talked about that much over here either.
And I don't know that matters to them. When I've done bits and pieces of work with KSW, and although they wouldn't mind having North America see it and consume it and understand it, they certainly don't need it. But when you say they were present and they saw what Pride was, what was it? Like what it was big and it was bold but what are the details that made it special?
It had a larger than life presentation that elevated the fighters into a heroic ideal. They put a lot of effort into video packages to introduce you to who this person is and finding these beats to give you a reason to care about them as a fighter, but also to try to educate you about how they fight at the same time. And presenting this stage that came off like F1 races, just a big international, we are like the pinnacle of the world's entertainment, whereas the UFC came off as America's, even though it was also an international organization, fighters from all over the place. But Pride did a much better job of portraying that grand scale of the world comes to this ring versus what the UFC was doing at the time.
If you were teaching a short course on history, how would you explain why Pride ended?
Pride ended because of the cultural phenomenon of the nail that sticks up gets hammered in Japan, and their associations with the Japanese underworld in the mild to the wild then became public knowledge and broadcasted essentially to the masses, and that is just unallowable. So with that being done, that was the end of business. Now, I imagine that they must have also played maybe a bit too fast and loose in ways that if they had better operational security, let's call it, they might still be around, but it would be really hard to maintain an organization like that in Japan if these underworld, these Yakuza connections are too known, too prominent, and too in your face at that point. Because it's not as if there weren't people that didn't know who certain folks might have been sitting in the front row, but that's a far cry different from if money was ever exchanged or the fact that, a lot of venues are owned by Yakuza in some ways. So, if you had to rent the venue, you still would have to rent it from them. And that doesn't even necessarily mean like it's how would you call it? Like, it's not like, hey, you're paying me money to keep your thing safe. So it's not like a racket necessarily. It can be. It runs all gamuts, but it's also sometimes like, no, they just literally own it. And so if you're renting it, you got to rent it from them. I'm not saying that's always the case, but these are just certain instances. And so once those manager producer types got ran afoul of these underworld figures and kind of, if you watch the episode, I say, look, man, nobody that got harshed by the underworld didn't know that what they were doing would get them harshed by the underworld. They did it anyways. And that's why I don't have sympathy for them, because they created their own problems by doing things that they absolutely knew were going to go against the way business is done in Japan, and business, especially with these types, which they were already, it wasn't like they stepped into it and like, oh no, I got blindsided. That would be a different story. That's not what happened. And then everybody that then ran with it as a report again, they knew what they were going to do. They knew that pride would be destroyed. And, maybe they might be the type of person that feels like they're an anti-underworld crusader. And hey, fair play to you, but do I think that, how about this? I'm not inclined to think that journalists are going to go out there and do things because of like a deeply held sincere belief. I'm generally of the opinion that they're going to go out there and do it because they think it's going to make them money, and they don't care who it hurts.
Thank you for that. That's the second episode in the Pride is the fall of Pride, and so those are really important details. But that idea, whether it's in politics, in society, in any culture or environment, the idea that we know what is and isn't accepted, and we just push it a little, we don't get penalized for it. We push it a little and we get away with it. And we push it a little and the audience or the environment accepts it. We start to think that place we pushed it is the acceptable place. And then when it all falls down, we act surprised. But we see that in politics, we see that in government, we see that in art, you see that in everything. That desire to just push the limit, get away with it slightly until you've pushed too far. Some kind of weird aspect of some human nature, I think.
Well, it's our ability to reflect on the moment neutrally, and to see like, hey man, you got away with this, instead of being like, yeah, of course I got away with it and I'll get away with it again. You thought I'd anyway, hey, that was something, wait till I get away with this next thing. Okay, life's not necessarily just a ratchet where every position you advance to somehow negates or isn't affected by where you came. So it doesn't work that way. But it's easy once you're finding success or getting away with something that you tend to you forget that you can very easily get blinded by your position and not remembering where you came from, and not just like, oh, I don't ever want to go back there, but let's say how did you end up there in the first place? Was there any reason why that was the case? Any reason that was due to you or external factors? And with that, why is being where you're at now so much better? If it's just because your wealth has increased or your notoriety has increased, like for what end? Those things alone are not going to tell the whole tale of how you got there. Not to mention, they're not inherently going to protect you from something if what you're doing is the wrong way.
Thank you again for doing Dark Side of the Cage for us. And thank you for chatting. As my adult lifetime, I've been a fan of your work as a martial artist and a creator, and it's really awesome to talk to you. Thank you so much, Josh.
Oh, my pleasure.
Pride was so rare and so special and so of the moment, so 90s, so Japan, it was really something special, and working on these 2 episodes of Dark Side of the Cage was a gift. Make sure you watch all 10 episodes of Dark Side of the Cage. It is on Vice. Follow @Vice TV on social media to see where you can watch it all around the world. We got 3 more killer episodes still of Dark Side of the Cage, so 3 more episodes of Deeper Into the Cage. Thank you so much for hanging with me. This is a privilege. Until next time, enjoy the hostilities, my friends.
Pride Fighting Championships was a great time, and nobody died. Well, I guess that's not true, but...
Yakuza bodyguards put a gun to my head. They said, sign it.
It wasn't a surprise about Yakuza existing in mixed martial arts.
When somebody's paying you that kind of money, you don't ask certain questions.
Fans and fighters started to realize Pride will not survive.
Dark Side of the Cage, Wednesdays at 10 on Vice.